so we had dinner with Mary the other night. Mary used to work with one of my colleagues at the Skillman Foundation, and Mary were really close. We had dinner with her. It's amazing bellwether. I mean, it was funny. Bellwether's everywhere all the time.
I know.
We were nowhere, like, right?
So I started in September, and since I started, we've hired like 10 people, which is, a good 30% growth in 6 months.
Parthenon has done everything that Detroit has had. But we started we were, so I live in next gen for Detroit.
Yeah.
I know nothing
You hear some
about
feedback,
next gen
Jack?
or anything, but I was a facilitator of the process. And we didn't choose Bellwether.
It was earlier.
Really close. And sensing that, like, next.
All right, why don't we get started? First of all, thank you, obviously, everybody, for being here on a Saturday morning at somewhat unholy hour. Jack Becker also has just informed me that he has created a hashtag on Twitter, MaxCon2014. If you feel so inclined to tweet about our conference, please do. So welcome again. I'm Sean Dooling. I'm an MPA candidate here at Maxwell, and I'm the Vice President of EPIC, a student organization that focuses on education policy here. So before getting underway, I just want to extend some thanks to people that made this possible. Whitney Shepard, where are you? Whitney's the Secretary of EPIC. You can hold your applause. I got a few people. Settle down. So Whitney's our secretary. She's been wonderful in helping us orchestrate this. Sam McQueen, who is our treasurer. Sam is right there. Thank you, Sam. And Byron Adams is our president. Unfortunately, he's sick today, so we couldn't be here. Many thanks to him. And of course, it'd be remiss of me if I didn't mention Jack and Amy, who have been working very hard to organize all of this. So we can give them a round of applause. So we've got a fantastic panel lined up here. These individuals kind of come from all over the country, and they bring a lot of different experiences in the education sector. So I'm just going to speak briefly about the four of them. I'm going to introduce our moderator, Kevin, and then I'll hand things over to him so we can get started. So Julie Squire is to the left of Kevin here. She is an associate partner on the policy and thought leadership team at Bellwether Education Partners. She most recently worked at the New Jersey Department of Education. She directed strategies for advancing technology-driven innovation and oversaw the state's Race to the Top program. Previously, she managed school board relationships and new business development for an education management organization called National Heritage Academies. She provided support to school building leadership and helped to launch new charters in Louisiana, New York, and Wisconsin. She started out her career at the American Enterprise Institute, where she studied a range of K-12 education issues. Her work has appeared in Education Finance and Policy, Policy Review, American School Board Journal, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. She received her bachelor's degree from Yale. We also have with us Ting Ting Rivers, who is to the far left. She comes from down south, where I myself was the previous couple of years. Currently, she works as an independent consultant in New Orleans, helping build financial and organizational capacity for public sector organizations. Prior to this, she was the CFO for Louisiana Recovery School District, the state agency responsible for turning around the state's lowest performing schools. She also served as Grants and Investments Director at New Schools for New Orleans, and she was the founding director of finance and operations for a startup charter school in New Orleans. Prior to her work in education, she was in the private sector with UBS, as well as Bank of America, and in government in the state of New York. She's originally from Rochester. She received her MPA from Maxwell. She graduated with our men. And she also received her bachelor's from Yale. Dr. Zedric Barbara, is to Ting Ting's right. He's a national award-winning educational leader who currently serves as the Executive Director of School Turnaround for the Syracuse City School District. As the Executive Director of the Innovation Zone, or known as the I-Zone, he is responsible for managing the for elevating the performance of 7 of the district's historically lowest performing schools. Each school in the Innovation Zone, or the I-Zone, is implementing one of the 4 federally required turnaround models, whereby student outcomes are expected to show improvement over the next several years. Zedric has spent his career working to improve educational outcomes for students in a variety of settings, including urban, metropolitan, suburban, and rural. He has served as a teacher, middle school assistant principal, middle school principal, district level administrator. Last but not least, we have Armen, who is in between Zedric and Julie there. Currently, Armen is the Vice President of K-12 Education at Excellent Schools Detroit. It's a coalition group working to ensure all students receive an excellent education by 2020. This entails on-time high school graduation for 90% of Detroit students, 90% of whom enroll in college or quality post-secondary training programs, and 90% of whom are prepared to succeed in that program without remediation. Armen is specifically responsible for leading the school accountability methodology and agenda that manifests itself publicly as the Detroit School Scorecard. He is also responsible for the organization's new school, school improvement, and school closure efforts, which include shaping local and state policy, organizing community, and attracting and investing new talent and programs. Armen previously worked as a consultant with the W.K. Kellogg Foundation and the United Way for Southeastern Michigan. Prior to that, he was a senior consultant with Lansing-based Public Sector Consultants. He began his career in New York City, first as an administrator at New York University, and then as an analyst in the U.S. Public Finance Division of Standard & Poor's. And he, of course, also earned his MPA here at Maxwell, Ting Ting. Last but not least, of course, Kevin Wenzel. Kevin is joining us from D.C., where he's currently working. Originally, he hails from North Carolina. He earned his bachelor's degree at UNC Chapel Hill in political science and public policy. After college, he was a Teach for America Corps member he taught 3 years in Charlotte, North Carolina, middle school math. He spent the previous academic year also earning his MPA here at Maxwell. And he was also the president of EPIC last year. Currently, Kevin is a STEM integration coordinator with DCPS. He supports STEM and blended learning initiatives district-wide. We're hugely grateful to him for his willingness to come out here today and moderate this panel. So it's very exciting to have all these folks with us, so please help me welcome them.
Great, thank you, Sean. So we have sort of an interesting mic situation up here, so we will be passing them back and forth just as a disclaimer. Just to give you guys an idea of the format of what we're going to be doing, first, Julie, to my left, is going to be giving sort of a brief outline of education and education reform efforts, just to sort of ground us all in knowing that not everyone comes from knowing exactly what all of the education buzzwords are before we sort of dive deeper into the content. Then we'll do a quick discussion, which I will moderate for about 40 minutes, and then we'll save time at the end for your questions, which I hope we will have some. So with that, I'll hand it over to Julie.
Great. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. So good morning. Thanks to EPIC for organizing the panel. I've been working in education now for about 8 years in public policy think tanks, state government, and in charter schools, and believe that education is the most important public policy issue of our generation and probably one of the most wicked problems out there today. So before diving in, I wanted to give just a brief overview of where we are in education, particularly in urban education reform in the United States. So there's something called the National Assessment for Educational Progress, and this has been administered by the federal government every 2 years since the 1970s, and most recently has started to actually disaggregate data based on urban school achievement. So just a few statistical snapshots of where we are. New York City, since 2003, their proficiency for 8th grade math has increased from 20 to 25%, and in reading has increased from 16 to 25%. So we're looking at 1 out of every 4 8th grade students in New York City being proficient. In Detroit, as I'm sure you know, there's some pretty alarming statistics. Around 3% of students right now in 8th grade are proficient in math and only 9% in reading. So just there are some bright spots in education, urban education policy reform, but we also have a really long way to go. So with that, I also want to recognize schools are obviously asked to teach kids a lot more than reading and math, and these assessments only measure those things. And I'm sure our former teachers on a panel and in the audience will understand what I'm talking about. But I do think that this data helps quantify what we already know intuitively, right, which is that urban education is hugely challenged. So my colleagues on this panel are going to provide a little bit of their on-the-ground perspective of their work in the reform community. there are three sort of main buckets I think we can talk about in terms of school improvement and school policy. The first is state takeovers, and that has been employed in California with the Oakland Unified School District, in Philadelphia. Pennsylvania did a state takeover of the Philadelphia school system in 2002. Newark, Patterson, and Jersey City have all been taken over by the state. And in a sort of a variation on a theme, I think the Recovery School District is also sort of a state intervention in schools. And so that's one sort of bucket where the state employs its legal authority to come in, often disband or sideline the local school board, appoint a superintendent, and start managing a school system from the state level. Another common strategy is a school turnaround effort, where basically schools are flooded with resources, right? They've given professional development, leadership training, new curriculum, new resources, technology, any host of various issues. Often, this was highly pushed during the No Child Left Behind legislation and since then. And those efforts have been tried across the country as well. So most recently, actually, through a federal grant called the School Improvement Grants, which has actually funneled billions of dollars into schools across the country, those that are the lowest performing, and achieved so far fairly disappointing results, I think. And then the third policy option that has become increasingly popular and increasingly successful, I think, in recent years is that of the charter school movement. And charter schools, for those of you who don't know, are when a local group of individuals, sometimes with the help of an external company, sometimes without, decide to open a school, and the school is funded for every student that decides to go to that school. Their per pupil funding from the state formula follows them to that school. And that school can operate often with significant autonomy from the district and from state regulations and rules. And so the idea there is that there's this grand bargain between autonomy and accountability, where the school gets additional autonomy, but in exchange they're held to very high standards through a performance contract with the state authorizing agency. And so if that school fails to perform, it's closed. So those are sort of some three large buckets of the reform effort, but I don't want to oversimplify what we're talking about here, and there are a vast number of policy issues that affect the success of school improvement efforts, everything from funding levels, the way that funding can be used, the strings that are attached to various sources of funding, teacher quality, mentoring, coaching, evaluation of teachers, tenure decisions, the quality of a curriculum, which is now in our national policy debates potentially being set at, if not a federal level, then certainly at a consortium level with multiple states all signing on to the same curriculum and writing that into legislation. The use of student data, school leadership, regulatory burden that's placed on schools, collective bargaining agreements, and hundreds of other variables that all have to align in the right way for school improvement to be truly transformational. And so I think that we've all been sort of on the ground trying to make those stars align, and it's really hard work, but it's also some of the most rewarding work that's out there. So I'm looking forward to hearing from my fellow panelists about their experiences and observations.
Great, thank you, Julie. So actually, that's where I wanted to go next. I would love for all of our panelists to sort of give a large context of your district and also talk about how that context affects leadership decisions and how that's moving toward student improvement or student achievement improvement. We can start with Ting Ting.
Sure. So I moved down to New Orleans in 2009.
Sorry.
Yes.
Can you use the microphone? Because I'm capturing this with video.
Absolutely,
Just
yep.
to make sure that we have it.
Yep. Is this better? Great. I moved down to New Orleans in 2009 and helped start a charter school, basically. And at the time, I didn't realize what I was doing. I was, very idealistic, as I still think I am, and wanted to basically, address social justice issues, by creating educational opportunities for kids. From there, I went to work for New Schools for New Orleans, and then went to work for the Recovery School District. So the context in New Orleans, to be very brief, was, the RSD was created as a quasi-state agency in 2003. When Katrina hit in 2005, it kind of really created an opportunity to wipe the slate clean in terms of public education. So Louisiana, at I don't know what it ranks now, but it used to rank 49th in the nation in terms of providing public education to students. And then New Orleans was at the bottom of that within the state. So, you know, having moved down there, just to give you anecdotal, I was hiring for office managers, and I had folks that had MBA degrees from the local universities that applied to me that could not form a coherent sentence in their cover letters. So coming from upstate New York, you know, good public schools, the level of public education that was really, had been there for generations was really startling. I would compare it to a third world country, and that really was how bad it was. So the RSD was created, and basically what happened was so New Orleans population before Katrina was about 500,000 people. After Katrina, it went down to about 260,000. Since then, in the last 9 years, it has climbed up to about 380,000. So it's still not where it was before Katrina, but it's much better. So it's really a city that's coming back. You know, it ranks very high now in terms of leadership and entrepreneurship, and so it's really a city that has, in many ways, people think that have come back stronger than before Katrina. So New Orleans before Katrina had about 80 public schools in Orleans Parish. Other context is the majority of kids that go to these public schools are Black and low income. Not a lot of other racial diversity, so mostly Black. The enrollment in private schools in New Orleans is 3 times what it is in the average nationally. So mostly what happens is the white families, middle-class families that have money send their kids to the parochial and the private schools at higher numbers than we see up here in upstate New York in terms of what I grew up with. And so after Katrina, the RSD was created to take over the worst performing schools in the parish. The Orleans Parish School Board, which was the traditional school district that was there, was left with about a handful of schools that were still high performing, that had some magnet schools, some open enrollment, but basically that had done well. And those schools have still stayed under the auspices of the OPSB, which is the local school board, as you would call it. So RSD, when it started, had about 33 direct run schools, because there were many that were shut down because of low enrollment. And it basically ran those schools, and this is all in hindsight, ran those schools, and the goal was to improve educational outcomes in these schools when they were being run by the RSD. That didn't really happen. RSD basically held on to these schools. They continued to perform poorly, and this probably was for several years from '06 to '09. And the superintendent that was there at the time, in hindsight, was a visionary leader, but a really poor manager. So when I stepped in at the end of 2011, there was a new superintendent that had come from New York, and actually was brought on to implement a school-based budgeting process for the school, which is one of the tenets of kind of the portfolio theory of governance, meaning that, you know, government shouldn't be in the business of just running public schools. We should create competition and create choice for families. When I stepped in to create a school-based budgeting process, what I quickly realized was that the finances of the state agency were really in shambles, to put it lightly. They were millions of dollars in debt, and none of this was public information, and none of this was information that was shared openly within the organization. And when I stepped in as CFO in the beginning of 2012, what we clearly saw was, so 09-10 was the year that the RSD ran the most number of schools, and since then, their strategy was basically like, so government is not doing a good job of running these schools. We're going to charter these schools as quickly as we can. So the school that I helped actually start in 09, it was called the Transformation School. So we started with pre-K to 2nd grade, and we shared the same physical space as the existing public school. And the model was that we were going to grow by a grade each year, our charter school, while that public school was going to shrink in size. So they were going to be 3rd to 8th grade and then 4th to 8th grade. And so that was one of the models of takeover that Julie talked about. And another model was basically to wipe out the entire existing school and just start with 1 grade at a time, which is kind of the KIPP, the knowledge is power schools that you guys have probably heard about. And the difficulty with all of these kind of transformations is that the Recovery School District where I worked, when I stepped into that CFO role, we were millions of dollars in debt. But also, our revenue base each year was being significantly cut because we were getting out of the business of directly running schools, and schools were being chartered. So when I stepped in, our operating budget was about $150 million when I started. And the next year, it dropped to $100 million, then $50 million. And this coming school year, it's going to be about $8 million. So at the same time that we were rapidly losing direct run schools, we were also trying to carve ourselves out of this deficit posture, and also basically trying to push these schools to become charters as quickly as we can. the academic gains that we've seen in New Orleans have been really fantastic. I mean, it's really unprecedented in terms of what they've been able to accomplish. But I think what I've seen from the ground level is that there have been significant failures in terms of implementation, in terms of how the district was set up, a lack of financial accountability, and a lack of things that we know now are really important, like engaging communities and engaging people of color in the reform movement. And so that it's something that it feels like it's not just happening to them, but happening with them. So.
Yes, good morning again. I'm Zedrick Barbara. I currently serve as Executive Director of School Turnaround with the Syracuse City School District. And just performing a little bit of context about the work that's taking place. I currently oversee the Innovation Zone. Here in the state of New York, due to the accountability system for improving schools, schools are designated as focused or priority schools due to their achievement. Once those schools are identified as focused schools or priority schools, those schools are placed on the list, and the school district must employ one of the 4 federal turnaround models. All of these turnaround models are tied to SIG funding that is currently available. Those 4 models include shutdown, restart, turnaround, or transformation. And so the school district, with the vision of the superintendent and the school board, has the authority and autonomy to ascertain what schools are going to be utilized for which particular model. And I'll just briefly go through those 4 models. Shutdown is simply that. The school no longer exists. Those students are placed in other schools, and those schools are taken out of the school district, basically. Restart is that the school is shut down, but reopens as another school with newly identified staff and leadership. Transformation is the model by which school leaders can be replaced and staff having to reapply for their positions to remain in that school. And the 4th model is turnaround, and turnaround is basically that the school leadership is replaced and 50% of the teaching staff must be replaced at that particular school. So in these 7 schools, which I supervise in the Innovation Zone school, we are in year 1 of turnaround. Those particular schools are given certain flexibilities and some autonomy to the way that they operate to decentralize some of the nuances and some of the strategies and interventions that are currently placed down through district offices. I think the most important thing about the models are that there are other foundational premises that must be in place. There oftentimes are MOUs or collective bargaining agreements that are in place between the districts and unions. And in order to move forward with many of the initiatives in the turnaround schools, it takes great collaboration between the teachers union and the districts. And in our case, we've been able to forge those collaborative partnerships whereby there's been agreement between the union and the district to implement these set strategies in the schools. So far, we feel really good about what we're seeing in the schools. Again, as we've been talking about, this is not one of the situations where there's going to be instant solutions. Part of the Innovation Zone has to do with getting individuals inside of those schools, teachers, support staff, and school leadership, to look at how do we go about educating students differently? How do we go about creating the conditions in a school that allow the barriers that typically impede improvement? How do we move those out of the way? So with the establishment of the Office of School Transformation and Innovation is where my office sits. We serve as a catalyst to remove those barriers. So i.e., in typical circumstances, a school may have a barrier, say there's a leak in the building in some classrooms that's creating issues. it may take several weeks or months, depending on the school district, to take care of that particular issue. Now with the OSTI, the Office of School Transformation and Innovation, those schools now get immediate attention to remove that barrier so it doesn't impede instruction. If there's a supply request for instructional materials, whether that's laptops, smart boards, Mobi boards, any educational curriculum resources that are needed, we work to go to the top of the flagpole so that the schools, the school leadership, and teachers get what they need. And so in a really high-level approach, that's where we are with the Innovation Zone schools. One of the overarching lines that I always share with the staff is that innovation and creation is not like a cereal box. And so it's not like Zedric is here to give you a cereal box of innovation. Innovation starts with the people. Innovation starts with questions and people wondering about things like, if students are not doing well in mathematics, well, why would we teach them mathematics at 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning for 180 days? Why not look at how do you go about rotating classes so that the student doesn't get that same class where he or she may still be awakening at the same time throughout the course of the year? As adults, we all learn at different periods of the day. So that's just one example. Another example would be, how do we utilize data to effectively restructure the way that we teach students in terms of, if we know that we have a strong teacher who is really, really excelling in math, and the data shows that, well, it may make a little bit of sense to have discussions whereby that particular teacher takes a smaller group of students with more severe needs in math, and another partnering teacher says, you know what, I'm going to take a high amount of students so that we can make sure we improve those the lowest groups, and I'll continue to push these students that are on grade level or may be exceeding. So those are just two quick examples of the way we want people to think about innovation, and then also how we leverage the resources that we have. We have an extraordinary amount of resources that I don't think we tap into in the community with situations that have been that are being discussed here today. And if we know that there are entities that provide certain services that may be more equipped, how do we leverage those conversations to have those partners to participate with us in the endeavor to increase student performance? And lastly, I would just share that improvement takes 3 to 5 years. Yes, you can see some gains initially, but when we're talking about decades across the country where some school districts have been in turmoil in terms of student achievement, this whole notion that you can just flip the schools or flip a district in under 3 years is really, really far-reaching. And so I often say, think about how long it's taken us to get here. It's going to take a little time to unravel that and get the right individuals in the right seat on the bus, and also get the bus going in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Armin.
Great. Good morning. Armen Harachin with Excellent Schools Detroit again. Thank you. Like, I'm humbled that I'm even back here. I was telling some folks yesterday, this is my first time back into this building since I graduated, and my brain grows exponentially every time I'm here and around. Like Professor Vance likes opening, like I'm like scrambling to take notes. I sat in Pete's class. Pete, you might not remember this, but I knew nothing about economics, and I was a 22-year-old here. And I came to your office hours one day, and I remember I probably learned more in that 20 minutes during office hours than I had in 10 years prior. So it's an amazing feeling to be here among you all, and I'll try to keep this short because I feel like the brain power is out here, and would love to get into that a little bit. So Detroit, quick context about Detroit. You all know Detroit's bad, right? Like everybody, like you've seen that news line, right? Like we got that headline. It is. It really. It struggled. My dad taught at a Detroit public school, Southeastern High School on the east side of Detroit, big neighborhood high school that is maybe among one of the lowest performing high schools in the country, probably. You could make a case. And I grew up in a small middle class town up the road. And I got into education work because when I went and visited my dad's school, there were boarded up houses across the street and around. There were liquor stores where I had recreational centers. There were there were bars on the windows, right, of a school. There were bars on the windows of a school. Like, we didn't have that where I grew up. Kids were told to go make a school choice. Like, I didn't have that where I grew up. I don't know about you all, but I went to an elementary school and then a middle school and then a high school. And that was pretty clear for me. And then I went to I've been to 5 schools in my life. And kids that went to my dad's school had been to 10 schools in their life, and they were 15 years old. We had a pool, we had computer labs, we had it all. We had what you all experienced in school, and my dad's school didn't have any of that stuff. And there's something very big about that. There's a wicked problem in that, right? And I would tell you, I would try to get you to understand here today, as we hopefully debate some of this too, that education reform has been far too focused on the supply side of education, has been far too focused on brick and mortar, has been far too focused on things like Teach for America, recruiting new talent, starting new schools, has absolutely forgotten about the inequities around access, around all that other stuff that makes it truly a wicked problem. So Detroit has 125,000 kids, school-age kids. Call it 150,000, thinking about early childhood as well. And we know early childhood today is a sorely missed shot that we haven't taken in education fully at this point. 125,000 kids. Detroit's income levels, keep this in mind, this is really big, of 50 top cities across the country. If you take the 20th percentile of household median income and the 95th percentile, just take a look at that. Brookings just published this report. In Detroit, in most cities, it's somewhere in the ballpark of 15 to 25,000 for that lower end, and somewhere around 200,000 for that upper end. In Detroit, the bottom is as low as it goes, 9,000 is the 20th percentile, 9,000 for a household, and the top, the 95th percentile, is at 100,000. There is no deep wealth in Detroit. It doesn't exist. It all left over the last 30 years. And you have very intense, concentrated poverty and systemic failure of public institutions across the board. It's interesting. So this time versus democracy question is really present in Detroit. Detroit's public school system, and I include charters in that when I say public school system. We have Detroit public schools, and then we have 100 charter schools. There are more charter schools and kids enrolled in charter schools today than there are kids enrolled in Detroit public schools. And we now have a thing called the Education Achievement Authority, which was launched 2 years ago by the governor. Of those 3 major sectors teaching kids in Detroit, none of them have an elected board. The city of Detroit doesn't have an elected council right now, right? Just elected a council and a mayor, but it doesn't have any authority. Democracy has not existed in Detroit in any pure form for a decade. We have dramatically changed the way education looks like in Detroit, and our data that has just come back tells us it's no better today than it was a decade ago. It's no better. And I think that as we look at that data, and we look at the charter school sector, which has grown faster than any sector probably in the country around in a single city. When we look at that data, it wakes us up to the fact that without a transportation system helping parents navigate choices, without real funding that allows teachers to be sustained and retained in great classrooms, without a public citizen that is engaged in holding their schools accountable and actually taking ownership of their schools, without jobs, right? Like without parents who have jobs, it's really hard to educate kids at a high level. Forget for a second things like reading and math proficiency scores, which you can put a kid in front of a computer today and make some progress in that. Think about teamwork. Think about problem solving. Think about the 21st century skills that we all talk about, that you all are working on. If you go to any high-end private school today, they're not talking about math proficiency scores, right? They're talking about the humanities, about the arts, about creativity, about innovation, about none of that stuff we can't even touch that stuff, right? And I think that the depth of poverty, mistrust for public institutions and private institutions, this democracy versus time conundrum that we have in Detroit, all have resonated and shown its face in a really wicked place in Detroit. So really eager to talk this out. As I'm sitting here, and I'll leave this to the moderator, but I'm hearing somebody, I know that you aren't a fan of school turnarounds, or the research showing it, I know that you're leading it, and then I was talking to Ting Ting, and we were talking about how New Orleans is the golden child of school reform right now, and Detroit has tried to take the playbook of New Orleans a little bit, and it's not working. And so the shortfalls of the New Orleans playbook in other cities, this is really hard work, and none of us have the answers. And nobody has the answers. And so as you step out of this space into wherever you're going next, know that it's wide open space, know that that debate is really alive right now, and know that you better step into it with some humility, because your answer will get stuck really fast. Final thing on this, so I'm part of a handful of national networks, and we go to these national networks, and everybody has the glossy PowerPoint. There's a PowerPoint that's been produced for every city in this country about how to turn around its schools, new schools, talent, accountability. Like you know it well, right? We all know it well. We've exhausted the what we should do, and now we're very much in the how we should do it space. The process in which we move forward is going to matter far more than what the thing is we're doing. We in Detroit have tried to do all the what's, and we've absolutely failed on the hows. And as we move forward in education reform, but probably any type of major social, public good transformation, we got to think really critically about the how and stop focusing so much on the what's.
And I don't know, Julie, do you want to comment on any additional context?
Sure, yeah. So I completely agree. I think that there are a lot of people out there that have the formula for school improvement, right? They know that you need high-quality teachers. They know that you need good school leadership. They know that funding needs to be flexible. And getting those elements all in place at the right time for a school to start making some real progress is incredibly difficult. And I will add, I think there are out-of-school factors that we can't underestimate. The way kids are growing up in poverty, their transients between schools, between neighborhoods, homelessness, all of these issues come to school with kids. And so I think that as we talk about the complexity of these issues, we have to think about the policies in education. We also need to think about collaborating with the other social services that are out there, whether it be child protective services, housing development, economic development. Those are all critical factors. And you know, as for a school turnaround, I think that there certainly have been successes in school turnaround. That is undisputed, I think. But I think we've seen a lot of progress with these alternative governance structures. But we have yet to solve the problem of democratic control under these new governance structures. And so I don't think we have answers on that one.
So great, thank you for providing the context. And a lot of it, right, is sort of doom and gloom. Sort of, these are communities that are sort of, they feel like fundamentally broken because their education systems are not necessarily performing the way that we want them to. To put a little bit more of a positive how can we go forward, I'd like for each of you to maybe reflect on things that are working, and also keeping in mind that scaling things that are working is uniquely hard in education. So how do we take what's working maybe at a very small level and improve it or increase its effectiveness?
Let me be clear by saying that the academic gains that have been achieved in New Orleans in the last 8 years large part because I've chartered almost all of our schools at this point, have been phenomenal. And I am not here to say any of that has been easy. From that McKinsey report, which was the kind of the framing for this topic we were talking about last night, New Orleans has really gone from really shitty to maybe fair in terms of public schools, and now we're trying to get from fair to good, right? And the fair to good piece, I think, is the piece where there's a lot more questions about what are the kind of the levers that make that success happen. I think one thing that both Armen and Julie touched on is that I think sometimes in education we don't intentionally, but we talk about ourselves in a silo, right? Like, public schools are the thing that will save inner city Black kids. No, they're not by themselves, right? With high performing schools at the center, how do we build these community supports that are needed? Because if the goal is not just to teach that kid how to read and write and get to college, but to succeed in life, and then in turn break that cycle of poverty in that neighborhood that has seen entrenched concentrated poverty for generations now, that's something that we are still working towards, right? And schools alone can't do that. And this is just personal experience. When I moved down to New Orleans, the school leader that recruited me there, again, from my very wide-eyed, idealistic lens, was this, he came from Teach for America, and we still hold our school leaders to this model. We expect them to go in, work 90 hours a week, and within a year make these kids that come in from the 3 grade levels below, read at grade proficiency, and that's still a model that we often hold. And it's some people can do it. There definitely have been school leaders who have been successful in doing that, but that is not a sustainable model. And that's not fair to ask our school leaders to kind of be placed in those pedestal positions. So how do we build community supports with education at the center that ensure the success of our schools and support the success of our schools, but also ensure that our families and communities are not a hind thought, but are engaged from the beginning, and stop putting them in this deficit model of well, they can't do that. They're too busy working their 2 jobs. They can't engage in the education of their kids in a meaningful way. They don't really know what that looks like. And stop putting them in this deficit model and how to truly engage them from the beginning. The other thing I would want to say is, if it's not obvious from my comments, racial justice is something that I explicitly value as a person and that I publicly speak about, right? And education reform, that's kind of, you don't talk about race in public policy in general, I would say. But to me, the outcome the process is as important as the outcome, meaning we have to have high-performing schools, but how we go about engaging communities and doing that work is also very, very important. And I think one thing I see in education is that in New Orleans, there's the reform movement, while it's being touted nationally, it's on very, unbalanced legs. Any kind of big wind, any big controversy could really knock it off its kind of pedestal, right? So I think people in the reform movement are very protective of, like, we only want to say the good things that are happening. We don't want to show our cards in terms of like what's not working. And I think that's the wrong approach. I think you have to be honest about what's working, what's not working. Share your mistakes in public, and because that way you seem authentic, right? You seem genuine in terms of we acknowledge we have some of the answers, we don't have a lot of the answers. And then that way you come across to communities as, because we failed in a lot of things. After Katrina, New Orleans got, we were talking about this last night, $200 million in one-time federal restart money to basically run the schools and restart the schools. And that was phenomenal. But when I stepped in as CFO, the previous superintendent that had been there, because of his lack of management, we had central office employees had 30 paid holidays a year. So every time somebody quit, they would get paid out like $20,000 because of their accrued annual leave. So there's like these flagrant examples of waste and poor management and poor implementation that we have in public education, in the charter reform movement, and nobody talks about them publicly because we're afraid that the naysayers will hold those up as examples of, well, you don't know what you're doing. Well, it's true. We don't really know what we're doing. We do the best we can, but if we walk around acting like we have all the answers, that's only going to make those failures seem even more like just gross negligence, as opposed to just, that this is an iterative process that we are all learning as we kind of go along.
Can I let me jump in here, because this is, so I actually think I'm energized by where we are in education reform today. Like the playbook that, like when you guys go out there, you get to define some playbook, right? Like you don't just get to show up and like, just implement somebody else's, there's a wide open question right now on how to do this work, and you get to leverage your creativity across all of your expertise to do that work. So that, for me, is really energizing. I want to touch on this racial equity. And so Detroit, this is very present, right? Like, I'm a white guy that lives in a suburb, and I work in Detroit every day. In many ways, I'm leading much of the education work. And so that's very present for me. You don't host focus groups because it makes people feel better. Let me be really clear here. When I talk about having people engaged in their own education, it's because schools and education systems reflect their communities. They always have, and they always will. The amount that parents and communities, business infrastructure, civic infrastructure values education is the exact education they will deliver to the kids that it's serving. And so in Detroit, we've tried to take that to a very different level. Our accountability system that we built when we first came and started building this accountability system as part of our work, a huge part of it was the school climate assessment. Students and teachers take a survey across all Detroit schools right now, and called the 5 Essential Survey out of the University of Chicago, and they inform how schools are doing with a very strong research-based tool. We complemented that with community partners and parents. We did an organizing effort. We organized parents, and we said, we're gonna send you unannounced into a school, and you're gonna walk around that school for 4 hours, and you're gonna assess whether that school is good or bad. When we first launched this initiative in National Heritage, where Julie used to work as one of the prime opponents of this work early on, people are saying, wait a minute, you're gonna send who into our schools? You're gonna send, are they experts? And we're like, well, they're parents of Detroit kids. They're community members. Well, what do they know about education? Like, you'd hear that, like teachers, like school leaders would say that. And you'd say, well, they know something about it, and they're the kids they're the parents that are choosing these schools. They would say, well, you can't just send them in unannounced because, like, security reasons. Now, I live in Ann Arbor. I walk into my kid's school anytime I want to, right? Like, there's no security issues there, but there's security issues in Detroit, right? Like, you can't just let people walk in. There was this huge divide between the people who are educating Detroit's kids and the people who that education system is serving. And when we first started this effort, and we pressed, I mean, we would have groups like National Heritage based out of Grand Rapids that doesn't have a strong connection to the city itself come in front of our Detroit parent organization and have them explain to our Detroit parent organization why we can't send a group of community reviewers into their school to assess their school. And we broke down that wall in a hurry, right? National Heritage isn't about to tell parents that they can't do this. 3 years into this process, we've now visited schools over 500 times with over 600 parent community reviewers, volunteers, for 4 hours apiece, teams of 5 people. And they walk into a school and they walk into the bathroom to see if there's toilet paper. When they walk into the school, they say, is it welcoming? Are people smiling when I walk in? Does it feel safe? Do you feel safer when there's metal detectors or less safe, right? Like, that's a big open question. So we explored this. We have both created an accountability mechanism as part of this work, but we've also started to build a new culture and climate around our education system in Detroit. We've empowered parents and community to take ownership of their schools again. When we talk about democracy versus time, it's really democracy, capital D, elected. Like, I don't know if we need elected school boards ever again. I'm not sure. Mark Twain would say we don't, right? And lots of other folks would say we don't either. But we do need small democracy, small d democracy, because our schools will never escape the communities that they serve. And this is where, this is a lot of the tension. I mean, we work closely with philanthropy. The Eli Broads and the Walton Family Foundations and the Gates, those folks are wrestling with this right now because all the hundreds of millions of dollars that they pour into cities to try to drive reforms, all of that can get washed away. It can't be sustained unless the community takes ownership of it over time. And so I think in Detroit we are breaking ground on that. It's painful not to see math scores move, but it's really powerful to see community in a city like Detroit take ownership of its schools again, whether that be capital D or small d democracy. And I think that that's the long-term play that we all have to be focused on.
Cedric?
In terms of just some of the successes that we've seen, and we talked about it a little earlier, it's not all gloom and doom. I think we all do this work because at some point with great minds coming together, we have no choice but to improve. I don't feel like good efforts, good deeds, they don't pay off, right? So our schools will improve. In terms of what we are seeing in terms of initial indicators, and we're just in year one of turnaround, we have, going back to the community aspect, which is very important, every iZone school has created what's called a turnaround school team. Formally, each school has a school leadership team. On this particular turnaround school team, we have a community partner, 2 parents, and then you have school leaders, counselors, and teachers that are elected by their staffs to serve on these particular turnaround school teams. So that's one way we bring in the community and outside partners to really have a stake. They literally meet every month. They may meet every 2 weeks with regards to everything. What will be the new school schedule next year? What partners are we going to work with? How are we going to provide students intervention? So we're really happy about that. That has been up and running since August now. Another key indicator has to do with discipline. That's a hot topic right now, and obviously news sells. That's why the bad news is put on and not the good news. In the 7 iZone schools, our office discipline referrals are down from this time last year to now. And so that's speaking volumes about the culture inside of those particular 7 schools. In terms of the school leadership, we have some of the most creative, most enthusiastic leaders that we recruited from across the country. As far as Nashville, Louisiana, and New York City, in those 7 schools. We see evidence of increased student attendance so far when we compare this year's attendance matrix to last year's for students. Our teacher attendance is in most of the schools is either at last year's level or above. We obviously don't have state assessment data back because students are just now taking those assessments, and we won't receive that data until literally after students are gone in most cases from this particular school year. But in our interim benchmark assessments, which we've partnered with Achievement Network out of New York City, who has a very rigorous assessment system aligned to the Common Core, we are able to see gains on standards that are to be taught at grade levels throughout the course of the school year. Some of them small, some of them a little bit more significant, but the moral of the story is that we do see positive trajectory. So when we think about school and we think about turnaround, of course, yes, the numbers for data, that's our core business of education, right? And so, but there's other parameters that help state the case for that. And that's like culture. That's how the school feels. How does parents feel? Are our numbers for PTO increasing? What's happening at our events when we ask parents to come? We've had multiple events in our schools whereby there's been standing room only. We had an event at Porter Elementary School probably a month ago. We literally had an auditorium that seats about 300, standing room only for performances for children. And so those are indicators which may not be in the newspaper or the Wall Street Journal or Ed Week, but those things signify that there's something happening inside of the schools. And I'll end with, as we talk about the things that are going to help us move forward, I think we cannot underestimate the power of leadership in the school. As a former turnaround middle school principal, in every category, when I served as a middle school principal at Carson Middle School in Greene County, Georgia, we increased in every category you want to name. If you're talking about substitute pay for teachers, we decreased it by $93,000 in 1 year over the previous year. When it was time to do staffing plans for the upcoming school year, the school itself, we had enough candidates to hold our own school job fair, where we had 41 teachers that wanted to come and work in that school. And that's just not indicative of my leadership, but that was indicative of the leadership of that school in their turnaround efforts. And so I want to make sure the leadership aspect is not missed in our discussion. Thank you.
Great. Actually, I would like to pick up with that as many of our students that are current students right now will eventually take an executive leadership class, which is sort of the ending of their time at Maxwell. So Zetter commented a little bit about leadership at a school level. I was wondering if we could also talk about leadership maybe at a district level, or how those things are important in terms of the sustainability of how long somebody's tenure is, or those things, what those important decisions are at that level.
For that point, one of the items that was discussed when he talked about these good systems across the globe, so to speak, one of those talked about the igniting of change. And when you have a new leader coming in, conditions for change, obviously poor student achievement, and when we talk about Syracuse in general, we have the Superintendent Sharon Contreras, who came in new and with a vision for dramatically improving the schools. And so the leadership at that level has to be an individual that understands it's not going to be easy work. There's going to be a lot of questions about status quo, which are challenged. And the longevity piece is very important. Again, if we are I see the school district and school systems across this country as a schoolhouse, and imagine a epidermic needle. And every time, I know that sounds painful, but, but I just want to paint this visual. But every time there's new leadership, there's this pumping of different systems, different procedures, different programs, different personnel, to the schoolhouse is just filled. And every time a school board or state board of education takes over a school district, when they come in, they come in and they pump in all of their initiatives, all of their strategies, all of their processes, and eventually the schoolhouse can't hold anymore and it implodes. We do that cycle every 3 years across our country, because superintendents' average tenure of a superintendent today is probably 2.5 years. And so in our talk in higher leadership and those that are aspiring to be superintendents and superintendent circles, it's like a running joke, I'll be fired in 3 years, you know, and we really have to look at that. So that speaks to the longevity piece, and it is important.
Totally agree with that. I think that is actually also very evident at the state level. Having spent time at the New Jersey Department of Education, I can tell you we had a new commissioner come in 2009 who left just last month, and that was one of the longer tenures in his role. And the people that were at the State Department of Education who had been there for 10 years were biding their time, right? They were waiting for him to leave and for the next roll out of new reforms to come in with the new leader. And it was very, very difficult to build sort of that teamwork. The change in leadership made it really, really difficult to sustain and really prioritize things for the long term. And I think what ends up happening for leaders in these situations is that they end up putting out fires all the time, and they don't ever get to the real issues, the underlying issues. So I think I've seen that at the school level and at the district level, but I've also seen it absolutely at the state level.
Just to add to that, this goes to the what and how again. Like, I mean, we reward the brilliance of the strategic plan far more than the execution and implementation of that plan. So I've been in Detroit only 4 years, and I've already worked with 3 different emergency managers of Detroit public schools, each with their own Detroit Renaissance plan, and none of them stay to start to execute it. Every top charter network across this country and every top performing organization, when I look across them, they all have one thing in common, and it's not what their vision is. It's not what their strategic plan is. It's none of those things. It's stability. It's a vision and stability in executing on it. Near of Kingsland is, we were just talking, he's stepping down from New Schools New Orleans. That's been kind of seen as the top harbor master type organization in education. He's been there for 9 years. People don't, 9 years. Jeffrey Canada, right, when he all of a sudden started landing on the front cover of Time, people don't talk about the first 25 years that none of you knew who he was, right? He was doing that job for 25 years before he ever got on the front page of Time, like the front cover of Time, right? You think about energy, you think about education, any of these wicked problems, we too often lift folks up for the really, really great idea, but all the people that have done the change work, they spent the lifetime in that organization, getting it going, moving in a certain direction, and overcoming all the barriers. And there's thousands of them that you hit, all of them, like one at a time, obstacle after obstacle, barrier after barrier. I say that as somebody who has worked in Detroit for 4 years, and it's really damn hard. And there's every couple of weeks, I'm just like, do I want to keep doing this? Like, how long am I going to do this, right? And the reality is, if you don't do it for 10 years or longer, you're never going to make a dent into this work. So.
Yeah, I would say, I think you just have to know yourself well. Working in government, I think, takes a certain temperament, right? And I think you have to know yourself. I mean, having worked in the private sector and then nonprofit and government, stuff in government takes time. It's probably going to be 1.5 to 2 years before something that you put in place, you see some sort of fruitful results that makes the hours of banging your head against the wall seem worthwhile. So just know that about yourself. When I stepped into the CFO role at RSD, I was new in that situation in terms of that leadership position, and it was 3 months before I hired anybody else to join my team. And by the end of the 6 months, I'd replaced the entire team because I just realized the people that were there were not aligned with how I wanted to do the work. I would say, having watched John White, who is a superintendent now at the state level, and he was RSD superintendent, he brought with him to New Orleans a team of people that he had worked with in New York. And so I would recommend that if you are ever in a similar situation where you're going into a new job as a leader, bring people with you that you have worked with before, because that will help you and make you not seem like you're crazy in those first few months when you're trying to change things. And you're like, I don't understand anything you're telling me, and I don't think it's me. And I do think what Armen said, it takes, from that book, Good to Great by Jim Collins, right? We know it's not the charismatic leaders, the guys that have the bravado that actually succeed in bringing long-term systemic change and gains for the organizations that they work for. And it's both true in the private and public sectors. You need people who have vision, but you also need people who can implement. And implementation is not about doing it by yourself. It's about being self-aware enough to know what you're good at and what you're not good at, and hiring for the things that you're not good at. Like, I hate accounting. I'm not a CPA. I don't like looking at audits. So I hired somebody who was really good at that when I became the CFO. And so I think those are in terms of key skills. And the other thing I would say is, I don't care if you're 22 years old when you're out of Maxwell, get on boards. Get involved in governance early, because from that perspective, you'll be able to see what accountability leaders are held up to, right? And so I don't care if you go work in federal government in DC or go work in the private sector at Standard & Poor's, get on the board of a nonprofit that you care about working on an issue, and get involved in the governance side early so you can learn from that side as well in terms of leadership.
When you think about the accountability system, so we've built accountability systems that don't reward longevity either. In education, I mean, we started with these stats and we do the same stats, right? How much did math proficiency move last year versus this year? Oh, it didn't move? Like, you failed. Like, you failed at your job. Like, we need to find somebody else. Or this, we haven't touched on this yet, but the politics around education are fierce. Like, fierce, fierce, fierce. And there are huge special interests on both sides, right? We always land on the teachers union as the special. There are huge special interests on both sides that are every election cycle trying to make the case that the other has done wrong for kids. And it is really damaging to kids. Some set of adults win in that argument all the time, and all the kids constantly lose.
So I do want to leave time for questions. I think that we'll just reflect on one more thing before we go to that. We talked a little bit about change fatigue, about people in the schoolhouse sort of getting overwhelmed with, you know, a new administrator coming in with their version of change. As we sort of progress along that, I'd like to hear what you guys all think of where ed reform is headed next. Like, we talked about different models of it, but what do you see if you could look 5 years down the line where we're headed as a country, whatnot?
So I think that there is a really strong movement right now in education towards differentiation at all levels. Teachers learn a lot about differentiating instruction for students based on the individual student's needs. We're talking a lot about school choice, where parents have different options that they can choose for their children. Technology is bringing that to a whole new level, where students are actually getting different instruction through an adapting algorithm that knows whether they know what if 3 plus 3 equals 6, and can predict what they're ready to learn next based on big data. So I think that there's a huge element of that, which I think gets a little bit to your initial comment around the demand side. We focus so much on the supply side of education, getting good teachers, getting good schools, but the fact of the matter is that there are millions of kids in urban schools that have vastly different needs. And so the more that we can create school environments that are adaptable to those needs, the more we can help teachers be able to differentiate instruction to meet those needs, I think the better off we're going to be.
Yeah, I second that. And when you think about, I often call people when they say our education system's broken. Our education system was never built to educate all kids in this country. And so this differentiation is really, it's an evolution. It's not a repair, it's an evolution of what our education system needs to be built to do now. When a kid doesn't fit into some learning style that a teacher's employing, like, you can't just say, well, that kid can go find a factory job if they fail out of school. Like, you actually have to figure out how to educate that kid, and that means differentiating instruction. I think that this demand side thing is very real. I think that that what we will start to see in education reform moving forward is a how many of you went and saw Diane Ravitch this week? I heard she was on campus this week. All right, so if anybody is on Twitter, you see that Diane Ravitch and some of Julie's colleagues and others have a real strong war going on for the hearts and minds of the education reform movement. It's very like, watch Diane Ravitch versus Andy Smirik. Yeah. Right? Like, watch those two at odds with one another. There is a fight for the hearts and minds of the education reform movement right now. I think the one place that they would both land is that this is going to be driven by kids and parents and the people that work around schools. It's interesting, they get there in different ways. But ultimately, like, how do we get really great information in parents' hands to make really great choices? How do we empower teachers to educate and differentiate instruction for every single kid? How do we free up dollars to be able to leverage against whatever kids need in different schools? How do we activate public and private partnerships and civic infrastructure and community around schools? There is going to be a huge small d democracy movement in education, and I think it's happening in a hurry right now.
I think as we look at what's going to occur in the future, I think two things. I think about, and I agree with you, I think the grassroots movement from parents is going to become more and more pervasive. I think you're going to see that on a large scale, similar to the Tea Party movement. I think it's going to become, as parents become more and more educated about what's taking place in schools and taking place in districts across this country, you're going to see that movement. That's going to push the reform agenda in whatever direction it's going to go in. I think the second piece of this has to do with the autonomy that will be given based on the fact that you're going to be held to a different accountability. This one-size-fits-all approach, whether, I talked about the 4 models, why does it have to be just 4 models? And so I think what we're going to see in terms of reform will be, what is it that you think is going to work for your set of schools? What do you think is going to work for this one school? And so I think you're going to see more and more options as we move forward in terms of the reform agenda, because the data is very clear. We have a set standard across the country in terms of what the reform should be and what it should look like, and the results don't hold true across the country. You see pockets of improvement in certain segments of schools in certain districts across the country, but not pervasively. So I think you're going to see much more choice.
Yeah, I think the pendulum swing has been kind of a one-size-fits-all, like all kids go to college, right? And it's like the KIT model. And I think Julie's point about differentiation is really hitting the nail on the head. We're seeing a lot more discussion about vocational education. I mean, not that every kid can go to college, but we, as an economy, we have need for jobs that are not just for your college degrees, right, 2-year degrees or technical degrees. And so how do we create schools that fill those needs in the economy as well? The other thing I think, one of the things I struggle with working in education reform is like the underlying premise is that government has failed at its job to educate all children, right? And all of us here who go to policy school, we believe that government is imperfect and in some ways inefficient, but we actually believe that it can do good things, right? And so that's something that I've struggled with a lot. And I think also the pendulum swing, when you look at folks that work in the ed reform space, because most of them don't work in government per se, they work in charter schools or they work in nonprofits that support education reform. We need folks like you out there who believe that government, when done right, can serve its purpose of meeting the needs of all students. And so I just encourage you, whether you decide to work in government or outside of government, to keep pushing that, I think, that agenda, that story, because I think sometimes I find it missing in that reform space.
Great. So I'd like to turn it over to the audience. I think we have about 15 minutes left for question and answer. And I just ask, I'll walk around with the mic, but say your name, and then also if you are directing your question to a specific person, if you could call them out by name, that'd be great. If you want to do that too. Thanks.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, I'm Jack Becker, an MPA student. So one of the things that was apparent, I think, when Diane Ravitch was here, is that there's not only this split between schools and the community, but also between teachers and educators and administration. And that seems, I think we've kind of tangentially kind of touched on that in various places. And, I think that that's sort of an apparent divide, too, within universities. And a lot of administration in general think, okay, we're going to come in and we're going to make change without teachers on board. So, what are the key questions and divides within that we need to address? How do we get teachers on board for change, or have teachers themselves drive change and sort of unleash teachers in the classroom? And Kevin, I'll let you address that to whoever.
With regards to your question, which is absolutely fantastic, and this is discussed in the article that was presented with regards to the the districts that improve, this whole notion of buy-in, which is important, but there has to be the opportunity and the realization that what we do currently inside of schools and classrooms is not always effective. So when we talk about getting people on board, I think it's more or less, how do we get souls on boards and hearts that say, hold on, I'm not a savior coming in from the suburbs to come and teach in an urban school. I truly feel that I can impact student performance, and I'm willing to follow and lead with some of these initiatives that are being presented to me. So I think that's one of the most important things about that, in terms of, yes, you have those discussions, but there comes a time when we have to say, I believe in this work. I believe in the children, all children. And I visited a school in Memphis, and a turnaround school, probably about a month and a half ago. And I asked this gentleman, and they are doing some phenomenal things in this school. I said, so how do you get buy-in? And this teacher looked at me, and he said, Dr. B, he said, what is buy-in? This is what we all believe. And I was floored. I said, thanks for the discussion. And I turned and walked away. I was floored to hear that teacher state that to me. And that's been looming in my thoughts for the last 6 weeks or so.
I want to, I don't think we can talk about this without saying something about teacher unions, which is, this is my experience in Detroit. So we have a lot of charter schools without unions that are fiercely failing kids. And we have a lot of Detroit public schools with unions that are doing great for kids, and both exist in both along that continuum. The context in certain states are different. I think Michigan is a very, very polarizing space around teacher unions. But just like chambers of commerce, just like we make huge cases out of the anecdotal story to make a political case that we want to make. And for the large portion of teachers, I think that they want to be great and do great, and they certainly want to be, you don't take a teaching gig for the pay, right? Like, come on, like, there's just no way you do that. That's why we're seeing all the Teach for America alums. They hang out at TFA for 2 years, maybe they stick around for another 2 years, but they all could go make 6 figures somewhere, and they do. Like, they don't stay teaching for a reason. But I just think in approaching the leadership and a leadership perspective into this work, stepping in with this venom toward teachers is really painful. I think Diane Ravitch speaks this. Now, listen, she's got her own interests too, and all of these interests when these people are debating, I feel like are adult issues. There are major adult issues. But if you I was an analyst at S&P, and let me tell you, there were a lot of dud analysts at S&P too, right? Like, just because we were in the private sector on Wall Street doesn't mean we were all like great geniuses doing hard work. But nobody ever, like, our boss didn't take a job, or our board of directors didn't, like, nobody said our analysts are awful, right? Like, if we could just get rid of our analysts, like, they're ruining, like, they're just underperforming. Like, I can't believe the venom that our public officials spew, who are, by the way, the managers of this system. Like, they're their bosses. And so when you think about that divide, of course there's a divide. Why wouldn't there be? And what other organization, when the CEO of Ford came in, he spoke greatness about the engineer's potential, right? And you just don't hear that. Every new leader in education, I feel like, steps in and says, yeah, we have to reform the teachers. They're really like that's not a good work culture. That's not a good way to, Dave, would you build an organizational management class around that? Like, but this gets sucked up in politics too much, and as leaders, you have to be able to separate the political discussions that are all about adults with actually executing for kids.
So I totally agree with what was just said, and I think, to Dr. Barbara's comment, I've seen far too many implementation plans of grand new reform strategies where buy-in is literally on the checklist of things to do, and that's not real buy-in. And I would also say, to the extent that the teaching profession has gotten sort of a bad rap in newspapers and from policy officials, that's where true innovation in our system is going to come from. And I think to the extent that we have state level policies around exactly what good teaching looks like, with 60-page rubrics of how teachers are evaluated, we are limiting a teacher's ability to try something new in their classroom. We're making the risks far too great, the consequences far too great for trying something new. And so I think that we have to have accountability, sure, but we also have to have autonomy, and we have to be able to trust accountability. I'm going to coin that one. But I think that we have to give teachers the autonomy and the professional respect to do what they do, and to hold ourselves accountable to do what we do. One of my greatest pet peeves of working in the State Department of Education in New Jersey is that we were rolling out a statewide evaluation system for teachers, and the state officials, we ourselves, did not have nearly the same rigor in our own evaluations. And so I think that there's a little bit of looking in the mirror that we have to do on the policy setting side, of what we would want in our work environments, and it's no different from teachers.
Thanks. I'm Zed Jelani. I'm an MPA, and I actually used to work at one of the hubs of the current education movement, the Center for American Progress, which sort of pushed a lot of the things you guys are talking about. And one issue I brought up with them, and other people who are a little more skeptical of this brought up with them, was the problem of school segregation, racial segregation, is specifically what I'm talking about, but also class segregation is an issue. I would bring this up to folks who are very, ardent charter advocates, and I'd show them research that shows that the charter schools are actually resegregating schools. And particularly in the Northeast, which it has the most segregated schools in the country. I mean, I'm from the South, I'm from Atlanta, and we actually have less segregated communities in the schools now than Milwaukee, Detroit, New York City, Chicago. We're more integrated than you guys are. And we've had, charter schools proliferate in part of our country, private schools, vouchers, things like that proliferate in our part of the country. And, it sort of worries me more as someone who comes from the South to see the possible undoing of sort of the victories of the 1960s, where the federal government basically forced us to integrate, and it actually worked really well. Georgia, where I'm from, North Carolina, very, very well integrated schools, and we actually have smaller testing gaps between black students and white students than you see in the Northeast because of that. And so I'm just kind of wondering, how do you guys, when you're sort of designing your systems and you're pushing these things, when you're working with communities, how do you tackle this problem of a possible resegregation of schools? I mean, this is a big problem in New Orleans, where charters largely are one race of people, and they're often filtering out special education students who may be from a certain predominantly one economic or racial group. Similar problems that are going to cause sort of a two-tier school system, which is something I'm really worried about as someone who comes from a part of the country where that was a history, and I'm glad we got past that, and I don't want to return to it, right? So.
I don't know if I haven't seen the data on segregation. My understanding of New Orleans is that I can't imagine it being more segregated than it already was before the charter movement. So I don't know that charter schools per se are creating more segregation. I mean, black kids and white kids already go to different schools in New Orleans, and that's just the way it has been for generations. But to address your issue, I mean, I think one of the keys is it's just not one of those things that's been really I mean, I think it's fair to say most ed reformers have it as an implicit value why they go into this work, right? But it's not an explicit value with which schools are designed around. So that's a really great point. I would say, but in terms of what's next, there's a school in New Orleans now called Bricolage. The guy who founded it came from KIPP Star in New York. So he comes from the KIPP model, but the school, which this year only started with kindergartners, it's very intentionally, in terms of, it's open enrollment, so there's no admissions criteria. It's part of the common enrollment system. But in terms of his outreach, he very explicitly reaches out to communities of color and also to middle-class communities. And you go there, and it's a really diverse school. And so that's one of his explicit values in terms of creating this school. And it's a school, and this is something that we struggle with in New Orleans. The schools that our charter leaders create are not the schools that they're sending their own kids to, right? So I think that's also a marker. Josh actually sends his kid to the school that he founded. And so there are ed formers out there that are trying to create different models, but scalability is the real issue there, right? I mean, I think if you create demand for a product, then the fear is that then next year his class is going to be all middle class kids, because the middle class families are going to figure out, well, here's a guy who knows what he's doing, so rather than paying $15,000 a year to send my kid to private school, I can just send him to public school. So then from there it becomes like, how do you maintain that kind of connectedness to those lower-income communities that you want to serve?
I also think that the issue of racial segregation in the schools is tied into a lot of other public policy issues. So for instance, the funding formula for schools, there's a significant amount of funding for schools that comes from the local tax base. And so there's a reason that we have white flight in a lot of cities where families that become more affluent move to the suburbs and send their kids to those schools, and that's because those schools are better funded. And in many ways, a lot of the city schools don't have that same tax base. And so we're looking at an issue. It's not just that we have schools where African American students attend and schools where white students attend. We have communities that are African American and communities that are full of white Americans. And so, there are a lot of underlying structures, and in order to address the latter, we have to address the former.
Yeah, I would not put that on the charter school movement. I would maybe put it on, so I try to, in my head, separate school choice from charter schools. I know everybody wants to couple that together because the charter school sector use school choice as like the way to get parents involved in this sector. But in Detroit, we have plenty of charter schools that are very much the neighborhood default school these days. So school choice, parents that send their kids to the traditional district are also making a choice. But I think our school choice system has, so Detroit is very segregated, right? I actually, people think, so white folks like me show up in Detroit and we're like, hey, I want to live in a diverse community, and you really realize like quickly, Detroit's not diverse at all, right? This isn't just because like you're white and like it's It's the opposite. Almost every single school in Detroit is 95% African American. The one school that's the highest performing traditional district school happens to be on a border of a Bengali community. So it actually has Bangladesh students. It has African American, Hispanic. Like it's a really strong mix. I think socioeconomic segregation is a huge issue, and I think that's where school choice has really fallen short. And the movement in school choice now around common enrollment systems, common transportation systems, those things create access. In Detroit, we have no civic infrastructure supporting that demand side, the school choice side, and therefore you have schools in Midtown. All of our high-performing charter schools are in Midtown. Every one of those kids is getting dropped off by a car every day with their parent. Like there is a sorting that's going on there. Absolutely, a sorting that's going on there. And our neighborhood schools are increasingly high special education populations, charter schools or traditional district schools. So I think to Julie's point, like it goes well beyond the education system challenges that have created that segregation, but school choice needs to really move fast in creating access and equity and transparency to make it work for all kids, and right now it hasn't.
I'd just like to add one point. Just like to add one point to that. I think we cannot forget about the fact that school boards determine attendance zones. So when you go to that question, we have to speak with school boards. Why is a district set up or boundaried in a certain way? And a lot of times you get that segregation based on the way the lines are drawn. So that's very, very important. And I don't think parents are informed enough to really speak and advocate for themselves as a community about the way that those lines are drawn.
So unfortunately, we are out of time. As you guys can see, this education is clearly just way too big an issue to have just an hour-and-a-half discussion about. But I want to thank Maxwell for creating this space and for allowing our great panelists to come in and share their perspectives on it. I also want to say thank you to each of our panelists for engaging in this discussion. And thank you, guys.